Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this Stubbington Community Action Team meeting. Thank you for coming out on a pretty chilly evening. I'm going to just have a few slides and just give you a little bit of introduction as to, hopefully the slides will appear, there we go. Right, give you a little bit of introduction to the local plan and the process, and then, as Steve said, Gail will then go through the detail of what it is that the planning officers are proposing as part of this consultation. So in terms of local plans, every council is expected to have a local plan, but the reality is that by no means every council does. I think at the moment something like about 60 or 70% of councils do have local plans. Fareham does. Fareham's is relatively recent. It was adopted in 2015, but a lot has changed since that plan was adopted, which meant that it had to start being reviewed very, very quickly. And in fact, you may recall, I'll talk a little bit about it later, we consulted on a new plan in 2017, and I'll tell you why that journey took a halt as well. But what are local plans about? Well, they're basically to allocate space for development, and that is space for employment, space for leisure, space for infrastructure, and what generally excites most of us, space for housing. So that's what goes into the plan, and also issues around green space as well, and protecting natural space and green space, and that's expected to be covered in local plans as well. So, why are we consulting again? Why, after we were here in 2017 with a new draft local plan, are we out here again? Well, the reason for that is the local plan that we put together in 2017 accommodated all of Fareham's housing need. And housing need, up to that date, was locally arrived at. So, the formula came down from above, but the actual numbers were calculated within each local planning authority area. They're coordinated by an organisation called the Partnership for South Hampshire, which is all of the local authorities in South Hampshire, but all of the numbers that went into it came from each individual council and went in unchanged into the housing numbers. Fareham's numbers then, 420 a year. So that was what went in there, and as I say, every site, and some of them were pretty controversial, but every site that went into that draft plan was sufficient to accommodate all of that housing need. So what changed is the government changed a document called the National Planning Policy Framework, and what the government did, suddenly we moved from how it had been for about the last 6 or 7 years, which was housing numbers were calculated locally, to housing numbers were put upon us from above. And the housing numbers for Fareham increased by about a quarter. And the reason that the government gave for that was that they were building in what they were calling an affordability factor. They were looking at Fareham's housing and saying, right, Fareham, your average house is about 8 times salary, so we're going to add 25% to housing numbers, bringing them up to 520. Strangely, Gosport, not Gosport, I shouldn't mention Gosport just at the moment, Winchester, whose housing costs 12 times annual salary, they only saw an uplift of 20%. So quite how these figures were calculated is a bit of a mystery. But anyway, the figures that were given to us are 520. We've protested loudly and continue to protest about those figures, but those are the figures. That's what we now have to accommodate in a local plan, and that is why this particular consultation is happening really all over again. But in terms of new sites within the new draft plan, compared with the old draft plan, if that makes sense, so comparing this one with the one we consulted on in 2017, the 2017 housing proposals remain intact, but all that has been added into the new draft plan in terms of allocations is about 175 new houses over the life of the plan, all the way through to 2036. And in fact, those new houses are, with one exception, I think there's a couple of dozen on the corner of Redlands Lane and the Avenue in Fareham. All the rest are actually in Salisbury and Parkgate, so that's where they're proposed. But the elephant in the room is the last bullet point that is an obligation to help others, an obligation to help other areas. And this again is legislated for. The government has decided, as part of the National Planning Policy Framework, that there is, and always has been, to be honest, a duty to cooperate with partners and other councils around. But what there is, a requirement now that unmet need has to be considered within a new draft plan. You might say, well, why? Just don't ignore it. Well, those councils that have ignored unmet need from their neighbours, their plans are basically ripped up and chucked back at them. And there are several at the moment that exactly that has happened to them. So therefore we have to look at that. And the main unmet need that we need to consider, and we don't know exactly what the quantum of it is, but it's potential unmet need from Portsmouth Council and Gosport Council. And the figures that we have, and this is an estimate, but the figures which the planning officers have supplied to me is that that unmet need through to 2036 for Gosport is potentially about 1,700, and for Portsmouth is potentially about 1,300. So we have also within this draft plan, and I stress it's not an allocation, maybe we won't even need it if the two councils I've mentioned don't actually have any unmet need at the end of their plan-making process, which is a bit behind Fairham's. But there are two sites in there, one at Down End in Fareham, and the other one within the gap, the strategic gap between Stubbington and South Fareham. So there are two sites which I say are not allocations, so they're not sort of lined and say this is what it is, this is how many houses it could accommodate, but they are two, if you want to call them, areas of search, which are in that plan. And that is about that point at the end, which is the obligation to help others. So, we carried out a consultation last year, which we called an Issues and Options consultation, which is a part of getting a local plan together, and that had 273 residents attended a number of CAP meetings, people responded in exhibitions, people responded, statutory bodies and others. There were about 1,600 individuals responded to that and came back to us and said what they thought. And there were a number of issues. I don't think any of these will surprise you. Very strong views on what sort of housing should be built. Also the future of retail, future of leisure space. Of course, we're seeing changes in town centres around the country now where they're becoming more leisure. Leisure is important, eating is important, as well as shops. Strong support for preserving communities, and that's the fact, recognising the fact that, of course, Fareham is not just Fareham. Fareham is Stubbington, Hillhead, Porchester, the town itself, Salisbury, Warsash, Lockheath. So individual areas, and a feeling that there should be some preservation of the distinctiveness of those areas, separation of those areas. Also a range of views about where further development should be and development locations. And not surprisingly, as I said, housing is what interests most people. So there are a lot of views about where the housing should go. So a number of factors, therefore, shape the proposals that have gone into the draft plan, and those include the bit I said about distinct communities and preserving those, and those other bullet points which are up there as well. Valued landscapes, that's an interesting one, and that's something which is new to this draft plan, talking about valued landscapes. And the reason for that is that we have, as you're probably aware, and I think I've discussed this before, Fareham, like a lot of councils, doesn't have what's called a 5-year housing land supply. When you don't have a 5-year supply of land for housing, you don't expect to do very well in planning appeals when the developers get refused and the land supply isn't 5 years. You expect inspectors normally to say, yep, that can go ahead. We're actually winning all our planning appeals and have been for a couple of years now. And what the inspector is talking about is valued local landscapes. And a number of those were in the Meon Gap, for instance. In places around Hillhead has seen more than its fair share of such applications. They've been refused. They've gone out as well, and he's been talking about valued local landscapes, so that's why that's found its way into the local plan as well. Concerns, not surprisingly, about infrastructure and the capacity of infrastructure to cope. Health and schools, roads always come up in discussions like this. Active travel modes and a diverse need for sites as well. The government now wants us not just to have big sites, but also little ones that small builders, small building firms are likely to be able to build out, and probably build them out more quickly than the complications around very large development sites. So, almost at the end of my bit now. There is a dedicated web page. It has thousands and thousands of pages in documents for those that want to really drill down into all of the sites which have been looked at, and the vast number rejected, it must be said, across the borough. But we do have to publish every single site that anybody has put before us and said, hey, can you consider this for housing or employment, please? In fact, there are sites in that document for 18,000 houses worth. But bear in mind that we only need about half of that over the planned period. So don't worry if you see sites and it's literally your back garden or somewhere behind you. You say, well, is the council putting that forward? No, but all of those sites have to be shown in that document. So there's a big resource there to look at. So that's the end of my bit. I'm going to hand over now to Gail, who's going to go into the detail of what is being proposed, and then we'll take any questions after that.